weird ancient Greece rules that existed for really good reasons. The familiar strangeness. We look at ancient Greece and see the polished marble, the birth of democracy, the first whispers of philosophy that still echo through our universities. We see ourselves. But that reflection is a lie, a carefully curated illusion. Scratch the surface of that pristine white statue, which, by the way, was originally slathered in gaudy, blinding color, and you'll find a world so alien, so brutal and bizarre, that it would make your modern sensibilities recoil. This wasn't a world of gentle philosophers stroking their beards in sun-drenched groves. It was a world of strange, unbreakable rules. Rules governing what you could eat, how you could have sex, how you mourned your dead, and even when you were allowed to laugh. And here's the crucial part, the thing that makes it truly fascinating. These weren't arbitrary whims of mad kings. These rules existed for really good reasons. Brutal reasons. Logical reasons. Reasons rooted in a desperate, primal struggle for survival, purity, and a deep-seated terror of the world's chaos. We're going to strip away the modern lens and walk into the world of the polis, the city-state, where every strange law was a bolt in a machine designed for one purpose: to keep the darkness at bay. The rules of the body and biology. Let's start with the most fundamental thing, the physical body. In our world, the body is a canvas for self-expression. In ancient Greece, your body was a political tool, a religious vessel, and a potential biohazard, all wrapped in one. The Spartan birth inspection, a state-mandated quality control. Imagine the scene. You're a Spartan woman. You've just been through the agony of childbirth. The child, your child, is in your arms. The first thing that happens isn't a warm bath or a tender moment of family bonding. The first thing is that the father takes the newborn infant not to the hearth, but to a council of elders, the lesge. This is the ultimate quality control check. The elders, these gnarled, battle-scarred men, are not looking for a cute smile. They are looking for defects. A misshapen limb, a weak cry, a dullness in the eyes. If the child failed its inspection, the rule was absolute. It wasn't returned to the mother for a life of tenderness. It was taken. It was taken to a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, the apothetai, the place of exposure. A pit where it was left to the elements and the wild animals. This wasn't just mindless cruelty. To a Spartan, this was terminal logic. The entire Spartan state was a fragile, hyper-militarized machine teetering on the edge of annihilation, surrounded by a sea of enslaved Messenians who outnumbered them 10-1. A weak child was a future weak link in the phalanx, the human wall of shields and spears upon which their survival depended. A weak child was a mouth they couldn't afford to feed, a soldier who couldn't hold the line. Their entire code of eugenics was a desperate, ruthless strategy for survival, a biological arms race with their own slaves. They weren't building a society for the happiness of the individual. They were forging a weapon for the survival of the state. The menstrual taboo and sacred soil. Now, let's travel to the sacred island of Delos, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. It was considered the most holy site in the Cyclades, a floating, sun-kissed sanctuary. But there was one very specific, biological rule that governed this hallowed ground. No one was allowed to be born there, and no one was allowed to die there. The rule was so absolute that it dictated the bodies of the living and the dying. Pregnant women, as they neared their time, were forcibly removed from the island, shipped off to the neighboring Rhenia. Anyone with a terminal illness was also transported away, to die in a place where their death wouldn't stain the sacred earth. This is the concept of miasma, ritual pollution, in its most potent, physical form. We think of pollution as a physical thing, something you can measure in parts per million. For the ancient Greeks, it was a metaphysical stain, a tangible corruption that clung to a person, a place, or a community like an invisible, contagious dirt. And the two most powerful sources of miasma were birth and death. They represented the messy, bloody, uncontrollable boundary between life and non-life. A god's sanctuary, especially one for gods of such purity as Apollo and Artemis, had to be katharos, absolutely, flawlessly clean of this stain. To allow a birth or a death on Delos would be to smear filth on the divine, to insult the god in his own house. Imagine inviting an obsessive-compulsive god to stay, and then bleeding on his white carpet. The consequences, they believed, would be plagues, famine, and utter ruin. The rule wasn't a moral judgment, it was the ultimate cosmic hygiene protocol. The rules of sex and the public gaze. If you think our modern world is obsessed with regulating sex and power, ancient Greece operates on a completely different axis. Their rules weren't about a single universal morality, they were a precise, rigid choreography of social status performed in the public eye. The adulterer's radish, a theater of humiliation. We know the term draconian comes from Draco, the Athenian lawgiver whose statutes were said to be written in blood. Death for stealing a cabbage. Death for idleness. But let's look at a punishment that wasn't death, but something far more creative and psychologically annihilating, the punishment for adultery or moichia. If an Athenian man caught another man in flagranti with a woman under his guardianship, his wife, his daughter, his mother, the law gave him a brutal right. He could, on the spot, sexually assault the adulterer with a radish, or a mullet fish. And this wasn't done in a back alley. This was a public spectacle, a performance meant to destroy the man's social being. The act was called raphinadosis, the radishing. It was a violent, phallic penetration designed to render the man permanently katapugon, a term of ultimate, sexually passive contempt. To a modern mind, this sounds like sadistic, sexualized madness. But the logic is chillingly precise, and it's all about the household, the oikos. An Athenian wife was not a partner in a romantic union. She was a vessel for legitimate heirs, the living, breathing seal on her husband's bloodline and property. Adultery wasn't a betrayal of the heart, it was the ultimate crime of property violation and genetic fraud. A man who seduced a wife wasn't just stealing affection, he was putting a cuckoo's egg in the nest, threatening to divert the entire estate to a child that wasn't the husband's. The punishment, therefore, had to be a symmetrical annihilation. The adulterer's crime was a secret, penetrative violation of the household's inner sanctum. His punishment was a public, penetrative violation of his own body, branding him as passive, womanish, and politically dead. The radish wasn't a torture device. It was a symbolic weapon to castrate a man's status in the most literal, visible way possible, without killing him and incurring the blood guilt of murder. The Panathenaic peplos, the rule of erotic weaving. Every year, a select group of aristocratic Athenian girls, the Erhephoroi, lived on the Acropolis, serving the goddess Athena. But their ultimate, secret task was a strange, nocturnal rite. They would descend through a hidden underground passage, carrying sealed baskets on their heads. They would leave the baskets at a subterranean grove of Aphrodite in the gardens, and pick up new, equally mysterious bundles to carry back. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, tells us that after this rite, the girls were dismissed and new ones were chosen for the task. But the rule that governed them before this was absolute and veiled in silence. They were weaving, but what they were weaving was not just a dress. For 9 months, the Erhephoroi and other elite girls wove the peplos, a massive, saffron-colored robe, for the wooden cult statue of Athena Polias. But this wasn't a simple craft project. It was a thread-by-thread representation of the cosmic order. The central panel depicted the Gigantomachy, the gods' war against the giants, the ultimate battle of civilization over chaos. Why this task? Why these girls? This rule, that only prepubescent girls from the city's most noble families could weave this specific garment, was a public performance of controlled female eroticism. The Parthenos, the maiden, was seen as a wild, untamed thing, full of a dangerous, chaotic power that needed to be harnessed and channeled for the good of the city. Their focus, their very physical dexterity, was being socially engineered. By weaving the story of order's triumph over chaos, they were literally, in a symbolic sense, weaving their own wildness into the fabric of civilization. The ritual was their service, a public declaration that the raw, procreative power of the city's future mothers was being safely disciplined into an act of piety. A loose thread was a lapse in the cosmic order. A girl who was not a virgin could not touch the sacred loom, because her undisciplined sexuality would pollute the very act of creation. The rule protected the weave, and the weave protected the city. The rules of food, drink, and the face. The strange rules didn't stop at the body and the bedroom. They extended to the table, to the cup, and to the most public expression of all, your face. The Spartan Syssitia, a flavor of bondage. In Sparta, you didn't just eat. You were a member of a Syssition, a dining mess of about 15 men. This was your entire social, political, and military identity. You ate with them every night. You fought alongside them in battle. And the centerpiece of every meal, the most famous and reviled dish in the ancient world, was the black broth, melas zomos. Ingredients? Pork, blood, vinegar, salt. A visitor from the luxurious city of Cyprus supposedly tasted it and said, "Now I know why the Spartans do not fear death." But here was the absolute, non-negotiable rule. Every citizen, from the lowliest soldier to the king, had to eat this. Every day. You were required to contribute a set quota of barley, wine, cheese, and figs to the mess from your estate. Failure to provide the contribution meant you were kicked out of the mess and stripped of your citizenship. This rule was a deliberate, state-sponsored weapon against private wealth and pleasure. The black broth was a taste of equality and a permanent reminder of their austere, military conditioning. It was culinary boot camp, for life. By forcing the richest aristocrat and the poorest citizen to sit down and eat the same disgusting, nutritious sludge, Sparta was physically preventing the formation of a soft, wealthy class that might prefer luxury to martial valor. If you developed a taste for fine Syracusan cuisine, you were a security risk. The Syssitia was a system of mutual surveillance and forced humility, a daily ritual where you swallowed the state's ideology along with your black broth. The taste was the taste of totalitarian equality, and it was the price of being a Spartan. The symposium's king, the rule of the arbitrary poor. The all-male drinking party, the symposium, was the beating heart of Athenian aristocratic social life. Wine, poetry, politics, and desire flowed freely. But it was not a free-for-all. The chaos of Dionysian wine was tamed by an ironclad set of rules, and the first was the election of the symposiarch, the king of the feast. This man was a tyrant for the night, chosen by a roll of the dice. He set the rules. And the most important rule he dictated was the ratio of wine to water in the crater, the great mixing bowl. To drink wine neat was considered barbaric, a habit of Scythians and madmen that led to violence and psychosis. The symposiarch's decree might be a civilized 1:3 1-part wine, 3 parts water, or a more potent 1:1. He also determined the number of toasts, the topic of conversation, and the punishments for breaking the rules. Anything from a penalty of having to dance naked to being forced to carry a donkey around the room. This was a social technology for taming a pharmacological problem. Wine was a drug. It could release poetic genius and philosophical truth, as it did for Plato. Or it could release the inner beast, leading to brawling, hubris, and the kind of destructive madness that tore cities apart. The symposiarch was a pressure valve. By ritualizing the consumption, by placing absolute power in the hands of a temporary, randomly chosen king, the Athenians were practicing a form of controlled civic chaos. They were creating a microcosm of their own democracy, where a leader is elected by lot to govern a dangerous, unruly populace, the drinkers, with a set of agreed-upon laws, the ratio, the toasts. It was a game, a performance, and a school for self-governance. A good symposiarch led his men to the peak of exhilaration, the height of wit and camaraderie, and then shut the party down before anyone's inner Scythian came out. The rule was the rudder that steered a ship of drunken men safely to port. The law of Solon against neutrality. Speaking of civic chaos, what was the single most important political rule in the world's first democracy? It wasn't a rule about voting, or taxes, or term limits. According to Aristotle, the great lawgiver Solon created a most peculiar law. If the city was ripped apart by a civil conflict, a stasis, every single citizen was legally required to choose a side. You had to physically take up arms and go join one faction or the other. To remain neutral, to lock your door and tend to your own garden, was the highest crime, punishable by atimia, the complete loss of citizenship, your rights, your property, and your very identity as an Athenian. This law reveals the terrifying fragility of Athenian democracy. Solon understood that a democracy doesn't die because a tyrant takes over with a lightning strike. It dies because good, moderate men stand back and do nothing. Neutrality in the face of a fight for the soul of the city was not a peaceful choice. It was parasitism. The neutral man was the one who would be happy to live under a tyrant, just as long as his own property was safe. By forcing everyone to commit, Solon was ensuring two things. First, that the fight would be as fair and decisive as possible, instead of being won by a small, radical faction while the apathetic majority cowered. Second, and more importantly, once the conflict was over, the victors couldn't just purge the other side, because everyone was on a side. The entire city was implicated in the bloodshed, and therefore the entire city had to be part of the painful, necessary reconciliation. To deny neutrality was to force civic responsibility down the throat of every apathetic citizen, compelling them to have a stake in their own freedom. The Gorton Code's rule of the half-breed. Let's move away from Athens and Sparta, to the island of Crete, to the city of Gorton. Its great law code, carved on a stone wall in the 5th century BC, is one of the most complete ancient legal texts we have. And it is obsessed with one thing: mixed status unions. What do you do when a free woman and a serf have a child? What about a free man and a slave? The rules are dizzyingly specific. If a free woman living in the house of a male relative has a child by a serf, the child is a serf, but is not to be put to death. But the real, grindingly detailed rule is this: if an unmarried serf woman and a free man have a child, and the man lived in the house of her master, the child is a serf. But if he didn't live there, the child can be free, after a heavy fine. The law spirals into a list of fines, statuses, and conditions based on where the union took place, who was in charge of the woman, and the precise status of the man. This isn't racism as we know it. This is a social system trying to maintain a rigid class structure in the face of nature's tendency to blur all boundaries. In a world with no DNA tests, a person's identity was entirely a social and legal construct. The law code of Gorton is a frantic, deeply logical attempt to create a sorting algorithm for a messy, biological reality. The rule about the location, was the free man in the serf master's house or not, is a rule about intent and dependency. If he was in the house, he was under the master's power, almost like a dependent. If he was outside, he was acting as a fully independent free agent. The child's very soul, its political and legal future, was determined by a real estate detail. The rule existed because in a society built on the backs of a legally defined servile class, A single uncertain birth was a ticking time bomb of litigation that could unravel the entire property and inheritance system. They had to draw the line somewhere, and the walls of a house were as good a place as any. The rules of death, grief, and the afterself. Death was not a peaceful end. It was a dangerous transition, and the most potent source of miasma in the world. The rules surrounding it were designed not to comfort the living, but to protect them from the dead. The law of the unfinished tomb. In many Greek city-states, a specific financial and social rule governed death. If a man died, his estate, his entire property, was legally frozen until his tomb was completed to a standard befitting his status. The heirs could not touch a single drachma. They could not sell a field or marry off a daughter with a dowry from the estate until the stone was cut and the body interred. This could bankrupt a family. The Greeks were terrified of the atarphos, the unburied, unwept corpse. A soul without a properly constructed tomb could not cross the river Styx. It was stuck in a terrible limbo, a restless, angry spirit, auros, that would haunt its family and bring misfortune, disease, and barrenness to the land. The law didn't care about the grief-stricken family's sentimental attachment. It cared about public health, both physical and metaphysical. A lingering, angry ghost was a biological and social contaminant. By legally and financially strapping the heirs to the tomb, the state was using raw economic power to force the living to fulfill their highest religious duty, quickly and efficiently, to get that polluted soul sealed away from the world of the light. It was a bribe, a threat, and a public health mandate, all chiseled in marble. The Opuntian Locrians' rule of unwritten law. Let's journey to the Locrians, a people in central Greece, described by the historian Polybius. They had no written law for certain capital offenses. If a citizen was accused of a crime worthy of death, like treason, the accuser and the accused would stand before the assembly. The accuser would make his case. And then, the moment of pure, terrifying legislative improvisation, the defendant would stand, a rope around his neck. An assemblyman would interrupt and propose a new, specific law on the spot to cover this exact crime. If the assembly voted for the new law, the defendant was executed on the spot, his neck snapped by the rope. If they voted against it, he was released. This is one of the most radical examples of a society's absolute terror of being bound by a static legal code that a clever criminal could exploit. The Locrians believed that a written, fixed law is a dead thing. A living, breathing democracy must be able to generate the law in the moment of crisis, tailored to the specific evil in front of it. The rule wasn't no rules. The rule was that a rule had to be created for each transgression. This prevented the development of a class of lawyers, of legal sophistry, of the letter of the law killing its spirit. It was a system of brutal terrifying and immediate legislative purity. The reason was to paralyze potential criminals not with a known penalty, but with the absolute, existential uncertainty of what the community would invent for you on the day you were caught. Your fate wasn't in a book, it was in the trembling hands of your neighbors. The Geloan rule of the Iron Man. In the Greek colony of Gela in Sicily, there ruled a tyrant named Gelon. He put down a rebellion of the common people, the Syracusui, and imposed a strange, symbolic rule on the aristocracy who had supported him. He stripped all the aristocrats of their weapons and their fine clothes. Then he made them wear simple animal skin tunics. But the true punishment, the lasting rule, was this. He forced them to go out to the fields, dig up the wild, thorny underbrush, and use that thorny brush to build a fence around the entire city. A huge wall of thorns, built by the hands of the former elite. This was not a practical fortification. A wall of dried thorns is a fire hazard that a single torch could annihilate. The reason was a total, theatrical inversion of their identity. Gelon was physically writing a lesson in power on the landscape and on their bodies. The aristocrat's identity was based on the spear, the horse, and the fine, soft linen chiton. By taking these away and replacing them with the animal skins of a primitive peasant, he stripped them of their status. By forcing them to do the back-breaking labor of a serf, he stripped them of their leisure. And the final product, the thorn fence, was the ultimate insult. A wall is a symbol of civic defense, the highest duty of a citizen soldier. But a wall of thorns is a pathetic, useless, and temporary thing, a fence for keeping goats, not for stopping an army. The rule was a permanent public artwork of humiliation, a reminder that their power was an illusion and that the true, sharp point of the city was the tyrant's will. A world governed by the invisible. We come to the end of our journey, and what do we see? We see a world that is not just weird, but relentlessly, exhaustingly logical. Every strange rule, the radish, the black broth, the half-breed's fine, the Locrian's noose, was a solution to a problem that haunted their world with an intensity we can barely comprehend. They weren't afraid of an awkward social situation. They were afraid of the gods' anger, of the collapse of the social order, of the terrifyingly fragile line between civilization and the howling chaos they believed was always waiting just outside the city walls, and inside their own wild, human hearts. Their rules were a vast, collective ritual, a spell cast over the terrifying randomness of existence. The Spartan elder inspecting a baby was performing a spell for military security. The Athenian husband with his radish was performing a spell to protect his bloodline from contamination. The drinker at the symposium, obeying his king for the night, was performing a spell to tame the beast of intoxication and turn poison into poetry. They lived in a world where everything was connected. A man who didn't cry loudly enough at a funeral wasn't just being stoic, he was a suspect, because proper, extravagant female grief was a social and religious requirement that only the guilty would fail to perform. We live in a world where we've taken most of that machinery apart. We call it progress. But next time you lock your door, or sanitize your hands, or feel that prickle of unease when a stranger breaks an unspoken social rule, remember the Greeks. Remember that you, too, are performing your own little rituals against the chaos. Their reasons are not our reasons, but the underlying fear that we need rules, strange and absolute, to keep the darkness at bay, that we might understand more than we think. The rules of the gods, ecstasy, and sacred madness. The Greek gods were not distant, loving fathers. They were terrifying, capricious forces of nature, and the rules for worshipping them were not about morality but about crisis management. How do you appease a volcano? How do you negotiate with a plague? You create a rule so strange, so absolute, that it creates a channel for the divine pressure to escape without destroying everything. The Arcadian cannibalism rule, the Feast of Lycaon. High in the mountains of Arcadia, on the summit of Mount Lycaon, stood a sanctuary to Zeus Lycaos, the wolf Zeus. It was a place of primeval terror. The central mystery, the rule that governed the initiation into his cult, was a ritual feast. The participants would gather around a great cauldron. Into this cauldron, they would place strips of animal flesh mixed with one other sacred ingredient, the entrails of a human sacrifice. Each man would draw out a strip and eat it. The one who ate the human flesh would be transformed into a wolf. The rule was clear: he would be a wolf for exactly 9 years. During that time, he must not taste human flesh. If he abstained, he could return to human form after his sentence was up. If he succumbed and ate a man while in wolf form, he remained a wolf forever. This is not a fable. This was a deeply held ritual belief described by Pausanias and Plato. The reason is a stark, terrifyingly literal form of social and psychological boundary setting. The rule existed to embody the absolute threshold between civilization and savagery. Every community has its dark side, its capacity for violence. The Lycaea ritual was a controlled explosion of that dark side. The man who became a wolf wasn't being punished in a modern legal sense. He was a scapegoat, a living vessel for the community's collective, repressed savagery. By forcing him to live as an outcast, a literal predator on the margins, for 9 years, the community was physically acting out the consequences of giving in to bestial nature. His exile was a living parable. The rule that he could return if he abstained was not a hope of redemption. It was a demonstration that the line between man and wolf is permeable, but must be guarded by a superhuman act of will. He was a warning, a controlled monster, a social vaccine created from the flesh of a dead man to immunize the community against its own inner wolf. The rule of the pharmakos, human garbage collection. This brings us to a more widespread and chilling rule, the ritual of the pharmakos. Every year, during a time of crisis, plague, famine, military defeat, the city of Athens would select a pharmakos, a scapegoat. The rule was specific and cruel. They chose the ugliest, poorest, most useless man in the city. A criminal. A cripple. A man who was already a drain on the civic body. The state would feed him for a time at public expense, fattening him like a sacrificial beast. Then, on the appointed day, he was paraded through the streets. Citizens struck his genitals with squills, a type of sharp plant, and fig branches. At the edge of the city, a predefined boundary, he was stoned and cast out, not to be killed within the city limits, but driven out to die in the wilderness. The logic of miasma made manifest as public policy. The city was seen as a collective body that could become sick with a metaphysical pollution. This sickness was the accumulated miasma of a year's worth of minor transgressions, bad luck, and civic tensions. A spiritual smog. The pharmakos was a human sponge. Through the ritual feeding and the public physical driving out, the city was engaging in a collective act of transference. They were, quite literally, beating all their badness, their sickness, their internal rot, into this single, devalued body and then expelling it beyond the boundary. The reason they chose the ugliest and most useless man was not just cruelty. It was a brutal form of social triage. He was already a dead weight. By sacrificing him, the city believed it was cutting out a cancer. The rule was a magical operation performed on the body politic, a violent act of civic cleansing designed to reset their spiritual health. A human eraser for the city's sins, to be tossed away once it was black with ink. The Maenads rule, the sacred, forbidden hunt. The worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, theater, and ritual madness, held the most terrifying rule for its female devotees, the Maenads. High on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, stripped of their city clothes and wearing fawn skins, they would enter a state of ecstasis, standing outside oneself. In this state, the rules of the city were inverted. They could suckle wild animals. But the central, most sacred, and most forbidden rule was the sparagmos and omophagia, the tearing apart and eating raw of a sacrificial animal. The ritual would culminate in the hunt, the chase, the bare-handed tearing of a bull or goat into bloody pieces, and the devouring of its raw, quivering flesh on the spot. This wasn't a wild party. It was a pressure valve of immense psychological and social importance, strictly confined by religious rules. The lives of Greek women were ones of extreme confinement and rigid patriarchal control. The city was a place of order, rationality, and the crushing weight of the oikos. Dionysus was the god of the outside, the wild, the dissolution of boundaries. The rule that his female worshippers had to go outside the city, become wild, and eat raw flesh was a ritualized, temporary release of the immense pressure that their repressed lives created. By tearing apart a bull, a symbol of masculine power and order, with their bare hands, they were symbolically dismantling the patriarchy itself for one night. The rule was, you get this one night, in this sacred place, under these strict conditions, to become the beast. If you bring the beast back to the city, if you fail to channel this energy into the ritual, you end up like Agave in Euripides' Bacchae, who, still in the grip of madness, tore apart her own son, Pentheus, the king who tried to ban the cult. The rule was a religiously mandated, temporary psychosis, a homeopathic dose of chaos to prevent a fatal overdose. The rules of law and the definition of a person. Greek legal thinking was a labyrinth where the lines between a person and an object, an intention and an accident, were drawn in unsettling places. The Prytaneans' murder trial of the inanimate. Imagine a court of law. The defendant is not a man, but an axe, or a statue that has fallen and crushed a man. In the heart of Athens, in the Prytanean court, the Basilius Archon, the King Archon, oversaw a unique and chillingly literal trial. If an object, a knife, a falling beam, a bronze statue, caused a death, and the human agent could not be found, the object itself was put on trial. The rule of procedure was exactly the same as for a human murder trial. Witnesses were called. The object was found guilty. The sentence was absolute. The convicted object was to be cast out of the territory of Attica, thrown beyond the borders. This is perhaps the purest expression of the concept of miasma. A murder, even an accidental one, even one without a human perpetrator, released a stain. That stain had to be attached to something. If it couldn't be attached to a person, it still clung to the instrument. The axe that killed a man was no longer just an axe. It was a cursed, contagious thing. To keep it within the community was to harbor a spiritual plague. The trial was not a farcical exercise in legal anthropomorphism. It was a deeply serious metaphysical cleansing ritual dressed in the garb of a court. By having a trial, the city was formally acknowledging the pollution, identifying its source, and then, through the legally mandated casting out, expelling it. The verdict was a surgical removal of a supernatural toxin. It was a society so terrified of unpunished blood guilt that it was willing to prosecute its own door hinges. Draco's law of the killer's kin. Draco's laws were infamous for their severity. But the most sophisticated, and to us most alien rule was about who could be killed in a blood feud. The old, pre-draconian rule of vendetta was simple. If a man is killed, his family must kill the killer. And if they can't find the killer, they kill his father, his brother, his son. An endless, exponential cycle of clan warfare. Draco's great, harsh innovation was the law of androlepsia. It didn't end the vendetta, it channeled it with terrifying precision. If an Athenian was murdered in another city-state, and that city refused to hand over the killer, the victim's family had the legal right to seize and hold hostage exactly 3 citizens of that offending city in Athens until justice was done. This was a masterstroke of brutal, limited-force diplomacy. Before Draco, a private citizen's only recourse was to declare a private war, which could easily escalate into an international conflict. Draco's rule formalized the violence into a legal procedure. It took the chaotic exponential logic of the blood feud and turned it into a state-sanctioned, limited, and precisely targeted act of reprisal. The number 3 is key. It was a measured response, a proportional threat. It said to the other city, you have a choice. Hand over the guilty one man, or your 3 citizens will suffer. It used the collective responsibility of the foreign state, the very thing that was causing the problem, as the lever for justice. It was a legal hostage-taking, a way of waging a miniature, legal war to force a foreign power to respect Athenian blood, without burning down the entire diplomatic world. The rules of the daily grind and the strange economy. The rules didn't just govern blood and gods. They governed loaves of bread and shady currency deals. The bread maker's epitaph, professional pride or civic threat. In many Greek cities, A strange social rule governed the artisans and traders who fed the polis. If you were a baker, the law dictated how heavy your loaf had to be. The price of bread was often fixed by the state. But the strangest rule of all was this: a skilled craftsman was not permitted to boast too much about his own skill, or worse, to claim his work was a divine gift that placed him above his peers. An epitaph for a famous bread maker didn't praise the fluffiness of his loaves, but his justice, his fairness in dealing, his piety, his contribution to the city's peace. The polis was a jealous god. It demanded that every citizen see his private skill not as a source of personal glory, but as a function of his civic duty. A baker who boasted of his divine, unique ability was committing hubris. He was placing his individual, ego-driven excellence above the stable fabric of the community. If his bread was truly that special, what happens when he dies? The city starves? The ideology of the polis demanded that the skill be seen as teachable, replicable, and done for the common good. The rule against self-praise was a social leveling mechanism, a way of preventing the emergence of a celebrity culture of craftsmen that could compete with the glory of the state and its gods. Your perfect loaf was not your perfect loaf. It was the city's stable food supply, and you were just the current, temporary hands on the kneading trough. Don't you dare believe you're special. The Spartan iron currency, the money you can't hoard. Perhaps the most famous economic rule of the ancient world belongs to Sparta, attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. All currency in Sparta was made of iron. Not precious, portable iron coins, but massive, heavy iron spits, the oboloi. A single oboloi was a rod of iron, and a handful of them was a significant burden. The rule was absolute. Gold and silver were banned for all private transactions. This iron currency was intentionally fragile, having been quenched in vinegar to make it brittle, useless for any other purpose. This was not monetary policy. This was a total social engineering project. Lycurgus, or whoever created the system, understood that money is not neutral. Money is a technology that shapes the soul. Gold and silver are compact, portable, concealable. They foster hoarding, greed, theft, and foreign trade, all things that bring luxury, curiosity about the outside world, and moral decay. Iron is heavy and worthless to foreigners. A bribe becomes a logistical operation requiring a cart. A man cannot easily hide his wealth under his bed. A pile of iron spits is a visible, clanking testament to his fortune, a source of public shame, not pride. The rule's purpose was to make the pursuit of wealth physically difficult and socially humiliating. It was a financial system designed to make you love poverty, because poverty was the heavy, rusty anchor that kept the Spartan ship of state from being blown onto the rocks of softness and luxury. It turned the act of buying something into a public, cumbersome, and faintly ridiculous spectacle. The rule of the Silent Sea, the Bosphorus tax. In Athens, the grain fleet from the Black Sea was the single artery feeding the city's hungry population. The ships had to pass through the Bosphorus Strait. The rule was that no Athenian captain, no merchant, was permitted to utter a single word about any other, more profitable cargo, or any alternative destination once the grain was loaded. The oath was sworn before the gods. The ship's papers were sealed with a specific, single-purpose rule. This ship's entire financial and physical existence is now bound to delivering grain to the Piraeus. The Athenian democracy was, above all, a hungry beast. A shortage of grain was the one thing that could topple the government faster than any Spartan army. The state could not afford to let market forces dictate the flow of life's necessity. A merchant might see a storm and decide to sell in a closer port for a quick profit. A captain might hear news of a famine in another city offering 3 times the price. The rule of silence was a psychological and religious shackle. By swearing the oath, you were not just making a contract, you were making your soul hostage to the survival of Athens. If you broke the rule, you weren't just a dishonest traitor, you were a murderer of the whole city, and the curse of every hungry child's ghost would be upon you. It was a legally enforceable supply line created not with contracts, but with a sacred gag order, a desperate measure to force individual profit seekers to become reliable civic life support machines. This was a world where the rules weren't just there to be followed. They were a bulwark against the divine, the beastly, and the chaotic. Every strange law was a scar from a near-fatal wound the polis had suffered, a lesson written in blood, iron, and terror, reminding everyone who lived inside its walls that the price of civilization was eternal, bizarre vigilance. The rules of marriage, the household, and the ownership of the womb. Marriage in ancient Greece was not a bond of love between two individuals. It was a legal transplant of property from one male guardian, a kyrios, to another. The rules governing it were cold, biological, and designed for one thing: the production of legitimate heirs. Romance was an accident, and often a forbidden one. The Spartan wife capture, a rule of simulated rape. In Sparta, the wedding night had a singular, shocking rule. The bride did not walk down an aisle in a white dress. She was seized. The ritual was called the harpage, the catching. The bride, probably around 18, would have her head shaved like a boy's. She would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. Then, in the dark of night, her new husband, who had been dining in his syssitia, would sneak away, seize her, and carry her off to a dark room. He would consummate the marriage, untie her virgin girdle, and then return to his barracks to sleep with his messmates. This clandestine, almost bestial routine would continue for years. A Spartan husband might father children before he had ever seen his wife's face in full daylight. The entire ritual was a piece of military-grade psychological conditioning. First, the shaved head and male clothing. This was designed to desexualize the bride, to strip her of feminine mystery and make her seem more like a fellow soldier, a comrade. This was to ease the young husband, raised in an all-male world of the agoge, into the terrifying heterosexuality now required of him for procreation. The capture itself was a rule of controlled transgression, a ritualized breaking of the boundary between the male and female worlds. It simulated a violent act to mark the transition, but it was also a rule of secrecy and scarcity that was meant to stoke desire. By forcing the husband to sneak away and then return to his barracks, the Spartan state was ensuring that the marriage bond between husband and wife would never, ever compete with the bond between soldier and soldier. The rule was a sexual firebreak, keeping the wildfire of romantic love from burning down the cold, disciplined forest of the Spartan war machine. The Gorton Eris rule, the patriarchal conveyor belt. We return to the great law code of Gorton in Crete, which contained a staggering level of detail about the patriarchos, the heiress. This was a woman whose father had died without a male heir. In most Greek states, she was simply a vessel for the property, forced to marry her nearest male relative. But Gorton's rule was a masterpiece of legal nesting dolls. The heiress was obligated to marry her father's eldest brother. If he refused, she had to marry the next brother, and so on down the line of paternal uncles. If there were no uncles, she had to marry the son of the eldest uncle. And here is the most exquisitely cold rule. If the heiress was too young to marry, or the obligated relative was a child, she had to move into his house, hold the property as a trustee, and the moment they were both of age, the marriage had to happen. But if the heiress didn't like this, the law gave her a single, legally defined out. She could pay the obligated relative a large portion of the estate as a fine, and then she was free to marry the next man in the legally defined queue. This is not a law about a woman's happiness. It is a property algorithm. The heiress is a legal ghost, her body a temporary container for her father's estate. The reason for the complex queue of uncles and cousins was to keep the land parcel, the kleros, absolutely intact and inside the bloodline of the original patriarch. The rule was a machine for reassembling the shattered estate around a single womb. By giving her the option to buy off an uncle and move to the next in line, the law was introducing a tiny element of choice not for her benefit, but to create a pressure valve. It prevented a situation where an old, hated uncle could claim her just to spite her, or where she might be driven to despair and commit some violent act that would cause miasma in the household. The entire code is a breathtakingly logical, utterly dehumanizing piece of genetic and financial engineering. Her consent was not absent, it was simply legally irrelevant to the mathematical problem she represented. The rule of the adulterous wife's public exposure. In Athens, the punishment for a wife caught in adultery was not death. It was a rule of social annihilation that was both immediate and permanent. The husband was legally required to divorce her immediately. Failure to do so would strip him of his citizenship. The divorced woman was then subjected to a second, more devastating rule. She was barred for life from participating in any public religious ceremony. She could not enter a temple. She could not attend a sacrifice. She could not wear jewelry or any fine clothing. Any citizen who saw her in finery was legally empowered to tear it off her body, strike her, and leave her in the dirt. She was made a permanent, visible monument to her own shame. We've already discussed the male adulterer and the radish, but the woman's fate was different because her crime was different in nature. The man was an external pathogen that could be violently expelled. The woman was internal. She was the breached wall itself. Her infidelity proved that the bloodline inside the oikos was forever suspect. The rule barring her from religious rites was not just cruelty, it was an existential severing. To be a member of the Athenian community was to sacrifice, to feast, to process with the gods. To be banned was to be rendered religiously non-existent. She became a living ghost, a permanent bearer of miasma whose presence at a sacrifice could contaminate the entire city. She was a walking cautionary tale, a physical lesson to every other woman that their body was not their own, but a sacred vessel belonging to the oikos, and if that vessel became ritually polluted, it would be smashed and the pieces left on the street for everyone to see and despise. The rule's function was to make the consequence of a woman's infidelity so terrifyingly visible that it would police the thoughts of every girl from childhood. The rules of grief, the body, and the performance of sorrow. If life was a public performance, death was the ultimate stage, and grief was a role you were legally required to play to perfection. Spontaneous, private sorrow was suspicious. Codified, public, ear-splitting lamentation was the law. Solon's funeral law, the taming of female grief. The lawgiver Solon did not just regulate politics and debt. He passed a sweeping set of laws regulating funerals, and his primary target was female grief. His rules were astonishingly specific. The corpse could not be carried out by more than 5 people. The women walking in the funeral procession were not allowed to wail spontaneously or to chant poetic laments composed by a professional mourner. They were forbidden from lacerating their cheeks, beating their breasts in an uncontrolled manner, or tearing their clothes to expose their flesh. The rule was, you will grieve, but you will grieve according to the script I give you. Solon was not being a cold-hearted misogynist. He was trying to dismantle a social time bomb. In the aristocratic culture of archaic Athens, a great man's funeral was not just a family event. It was a political rally. The clan would hire dozens of professional female mourners. These women would whip themselves into an ecstasy of grief, tear their hair, draw blood, and sing songs not just of sorrow, but of vengeance. They would explicitly name the dead man's enemies and call upon his sons to take up arms and exact revenge. A funeral could, and regularly did, become the flashpoint for a new round of the blood feud, an intergenerational cycle of violence that was tearing the city apart. By banning the professional mourners and the uncontrolled, dramatic displays of female grief, Solon was literally disarming the vendetta machine. He wasn't suppressing emotion. He was suppressing the ritualized, public incitement to murder. The rule was a form of acoustic and visual peacekeeping. He was saying, you can mourn your dead, but you cannot use that grief as a weapon to kill the living. The rule of the Kidia, the mandatory accusation. In the aftermath of a death, a strange and absolute rule fell upon the male relatives, the Kidia. If a man was killed, it was not just a right but a sacred, legally enforced duty for his closest male relative to find the killer and formally indict him. If a father was killed and the son, now the head of the household, failed to bring a charge, he was committing an act of such profound impiety that it was a criminal offense. He could be ostracized, his inheritance challenged, his very right to speak in the assembly revoked. He would be haunted not only by his father's ghost but by the state's righteous fury. This rule shatters our modern notion that a victim's family gets to decide whether to press charges. In the Athenian mind, the unavenged ghost was a blight on the entire community, not just the family. The son's duty was not to his own feelings of forgiveness or mercy, it was to his father's restless spirit, to his family's honor, and above all, to the religious purity of the city. If he forgave the killer and refused to prosecute, he wasn't being a noble soul turning the other cheek. He was actively harboring miasma inside his household and, by extension, inside the city walls. He was becoming a spiritual accomplice. The mandatory accusation rule transformed personal vengeance from a chaotic, emotional impulse into a formal, predictable, and controllable legal procedure. It was a law that forced a man into a role he could not refuse, the living instrument of the dead's demand for justice. Your grief was not your own. It was a legal and cosmic duty. The rules of war and the unspoken codes. Even in the brutal chaos of hoplite warfare, there were rules. Not written treaties, but codes so deeply ingrained they were almost a religion. And these rules were designed to make the impossible, standing in a bronze sweatbox and stabbing your neighbor, psychologically possible. The lyric of the spear. After a phalanx battle, one side would break. The terror would seize them, they would drop their shields, and they would run. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability and maximum slaughter. But there was a hard, unspoken rule among almost all Greek city-states. The pursuit was shockingly limited. The victors would chase the enemy for a mile, maybe two. They would kill a few hundred stragglers, strip the enemy dead of their armor, and then they would stop. They would let the enemy army reform and retreat. They would not pursue them to their city. They would not block the retrieval of the enemy dead. The moment the victory was decisive, the killing was, by a powerful, unwritten rule, effectively over. This was a strategic logic born of shared class consciousness. The armies were composed of citizen farmers. The men you were fighting were essentially you, just from the next valley. The goal of war was not the total annihilation of the enemy population. That was a barbarian act, a polmos without limits. The goal was a decisive, limited contest of courage and strength to resolve a specific dispute over a border or a piece of land. If you pursued an enemy ruthlessly and massacred them down to the last man, you were doing two stupid things. First, you were creating a blood feud of unimaginable intensity that would last for 100 years. Second, and more practically, you were destroying their citizen body. Next year, who would you fight? The same farmer citizens you spared this year would be the ones who, after a treaty, would face the next invader alongside you. The rule of limited pursuit was a ritualized, brutal but rational agreement between the hoplite class of all cities to keep war a finite, seasonal sport, not an apocalyptic genocide. It was a professional courtesy among murderers, designed to ensure the survival of the game. the unmovable god. After the limited pursuit, the victors would perform a ritual that was absolute. They would gather the captured armor of the enemy dead, the shields, the breastplates, the helmets. They would find a tree at the exact spot where the enemy phalanx first broke, the trope. On that spot, they would nail a set of armor to the tree, creating a human-shaped effigy, a tropaeon, a trophy. The rule was this: the trophy was dedicated to Zeus Tropeos, the god of the turning point. And it was sacred. It was a religious object. A permanent stone trophy was forbidden. The wooden, makeshift trophy was to be left on the battlefield to rot, untouched. If an enemy city later came and destroyed it, that was an act of such profound sacrilege it was believed to call down divine curses. The trophy was not a gloating monument to military prowess. It was a boundary marker, a pin stuck in the map of time and space declaring, this is where the fear turned. This is where Zeus decided the outcome. To make a permanent stone monument of a victory over a fellow Greek city was considered hubristic, a dangerous, prideful act that would offend the gods, who had merely lent you the victory. The rotting, temporary trophy was a physical manifestation of the correct, pious mindset. It said, this is not our victory, it is Zeus's. Our feud with our enemy is a temporary thing, and as this wooden effigy rots and returns to the earth, so too should the hate between us eventually dissolve. The rule to leave it untouched was a rule of enforced modesty, a refusal to let a single day's brutal work petrify into an eternal monument of hate between kindred peoples. The rule of forgetting and the construction of memory. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most psychologically profound rule of all. A rule designed not to remember, but to force a society to forget. The amnesty of 403 BC, the rule against memory. Athens had torn itself apart. After their catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War, a brutal, pro-Spartan oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants seized power. They murdered and plundered. It was a reign of terror. After a year of bloody civil war, the Democrats fought their way back and won. The natural, historical, inevitable next step was a massive purge, a violent reckoning. The Democrats were victors. The oligarchs were traitors, murderers, and collaborators. The families of the dead wanted blood. And then, the democracy did the strangest, most unnatural thing a human society has ever done. They passed a law. A simple, devastatingly hard rule. Me nesikakian. It translates as, do not remember the evils. A general amnesty. It was a legally enforced forgetting. You could not bring a charge against any citizen for any crime committed during the reign of the 30, save for the 30 themselves and a handful of their most senior officials. The law even forced the oligarch's supporters to file their accounts publicly to draw a financial line under the terror. The oath everyone had to swear was, I will not remember the evils, nor will I let anyone else remember them. This is the most radical piece of social technology the ancient world produced. The reason was a terrifyingly clear-eyed understanding that a society cannot survive on justice alone. The Athenian Democrats understood that if they began to prosecute every man who had passively benefited from the oligarchy, or who had named a neighbor under torture, or who had bought a dead man's confiscated property at auction, the trials would never end. The cycle of recrimination would rip the city in half again, and a new tyrant would surely rise from the ashes. The rule was a collective, conscious decision to choose civic survival over personal vengeance. It was a rule that forcibly sutured a hemorrhaging wound. It said, your trauma is real, your anger is just, but your city is more important. The word amnesty itself comes from amnestia, forgetfulness. They didn't just forgive, they legally mandated a collective amnesia, a firewall in the brain of the polis, to stop the past from poisoning the future. It was a rule that admitted a terrible truth. For a civilization to continue, it sometimes has to look its deepest wounds in the face and, with an act of supreme collective will, agree to call them healed, even when the scar tissue burns. The cage of reason. We end where we began, but now the marble statue is not just painted. It is cracked, stained, and breathing. Ancient Greece was not a serene temple of reason. It was a cage of rules, a vast, intricate machine built by a people who stared into the abyss of chaos, divine wrath, civic collapse, female power, the terror of the unavenged dead, and decided to build a wall of strange, rigid, terrifyingly logical laws to keep it at bay. The Spartan infant in the chasm, the Athenian wife barred from the temple, the Maenad tearing a bowl apart on the mountain, the citizens swearing to forget the unforgivable. They are all part of the same picture. Their reasons were not our reasons. We see cruelty in their logic, and logic in their cruelty. But the fundamental human project remains the same. We still draw lines. We still create rules to tame the chaos of our bodies, our griefs, our memories. Their rules, forged in a world of bronze and blood, are a mirror held up to our own, more subtle cages. And the question they leave us with is not, how could they be so strange? But, what are the rules we follow, with equally fervent logic, that will seem just as strange and horrifying to the world that comes after us?